Hone 0, the Wicker Man of the Celtic Druids. Imagine standing on a hilltop in ancient Gaul at dusk. The air smells of damp oak and burning tallow. Wind carries, chanting in a language you don't understand. Above the tree line, a colossal wooden figure looms 20, maybe 30 feet tall, limbs woven from green willow branches, its hollow belly packed with shapes that move. One Roman account claims a single wicker structure could hold dozens of people at once, burned alive in a single ritual night. The mechanism behind this alleged practice ties to what Druids called sacred reciprocity, the belief that the gods required a life to spare many. Julius Caesar, in his own writings, claimed the Gauls believed only a human death could satisfy divine anger after crimes like theft or plague. The victims, according to Roman sources, were often criminals or prisoners of war, chosen because their deaths carried less social cost to the tribe. Julius Caesar documented this in Commentari de Bello Gallico, written around 50 S BCE during his campaigns in Gaul, describing what he says he witnessed or was told by local informants. Picture the final moment. Bodies packed shoulder to shoulder inside a woven cage, smoke rising before flame ever touches skin, the structure groaning under its own weight. The domino effect reached further than any single execution. Rome used these accounts, real or exaggerated, as propaganda, branding Celtic religion as savage and justifying conquest across Western Europe. An entire culture's spiritual identity was rewritten by its conquerors' pens, and that rewritten image survived 2,000 years into modern film and folklore. Imagine being one of the chosen. You've committed a crime theft of livestock, perhaps, and now elders bind your wrists with rope, leading you toward a structure you helped build seasons earlier. However, many archaeologists today argue the Wicker Man may never have existed at all. Modern historians like Ronald Hutton point out zero physical evidence, no ash layers, no burn pits has ever been found at Celtic sites, suggesting Roman writers invented or exaggerated the practice to dehumanize a rival people. If a ritual described by conquerors might be pure fiction, what happens when the evidence is undeniable, pulled straight from the frozen earth? #9, the heart extraction of the Aztec Empire. Imagine standing atop the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan at sunrise. Copal incense burns thick in your throat. Below, thousands of onlookers pack the plaza. The stone beneath your feet is warm, and not from the sun. Spanish chroniclers recorded that during the temple's 1487 dedication, priests may have sacrificed thousands of captives over 4 days. A number modern historians still debate, but no longer dismiss outright. The ritual centered on a belief called Nextlau Altalizli, a debt payment to the gods, believed necessary to keep the sun moving across the sky each day. Priests used an obsidian blade called a tech paddle to open the chest cavity beneath the ribs, removing the still-beating heart in seconds, an act requiring precise anatomical knowledge passed down through priestly training. Archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, who led excavations of the Templo Mayor starting in 1978, uncovered a massive stone disc depicting the dismembered goddess Coil Sauqui, along with skull racks called tsompantli, containing hundreds of preserved human skulls. Picture the captive at the top of the steps, 4 priests holding each limb against a curved stone, the sky the last thing they see. The consequences rippled into geopolitics. Neighboring city-states, terrified of being captured for these rituals, formed alliances against the Aztecs. Alliances Hernán Cortés later exploited, recruiting tens of thousands of native warriors, who saw the Spanish as liberators rather than conquerors. Imagine being a Tlaxcalan warrior captured in a flower war, a ritual conflict fought specifically to take prisoners for sacrifice rather than territory. You knew your capture meant one destination. However, scholars like Ross Hassig argue the death tolls in Spanish accounts were dramatically inflated to justify colonial conquest as a moral rescue mission, and that sacrifice numbers were likely far smaller than the tens of thousands often cited. If a religion built entire wars around collecting victims, what civilization turned the deaths of infants into a business transaction with its gods? Hashite, the Tophet of Carthage. Imagine standing in an open-air sanctuary outside ancient Carthage at night. The ground beneath you is uneven, packed with buried stone markers. Smoke and the smell of scorched fat drift from a central pit. Somewhere nearby, drums cover the sound of what's happening. Excavations at the Carthage Tophet uncovered urns containing the cremated remains of an estimated 20,000 infants and young children buried over several centuries. Ancient writers described a practice called Moche, a votive sacrifice offered to the gods, Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, typically during times of crisis, such as war or famine. The mechanism, according to Greek and Roman sources, involved placing an infant into the arms of a bronze statue that tilted forward into fire, though whether this exact device existed remains a subject of fierce debate. Bioarchaeologist Jeffrey Schwartz analyzed hundreds of cremated remains from the Tophet in a 2010 study published in Antiquity, concluding that many bones showed signs consistent with prenatal or neonatal death rather than deliberate killing. Picture a Carthaginian mother placing a small bundle into a priest's hands, unsure if the god's anger has truly been lifted. The wider consequence shaped Carthage's reputation for 1,000 years. Roman writers seized on the Tophet as proof of Carthaginian barbarism, a narrative used to justify the total destruction of the city in 146 BCE during the Third Punic War, its population enslaved and its buildings razed to rubble. Imagine being a priest in that sanctuary, watching a shipment of stone markers arrive after a lost battle, knowing the city expects the gods to be answered. However, historian Josephine Quinn argues in her research that the sheer number and consistent age pattern of the remains make accidental infant mortality alone an unlikely explanation, suggesting ritual sacrifice did occur even if Roman accounts exaggerated its scale. If a debate this fierce still rages over bones and urns, wait until you see what waits frozen inside a mountain glacier, preserved well enough to still show fear on its face. #7. The Ice Maiden Sacrifices of the Inca. Imagine climbing above 20,000 feet in the Andes, lungs burning, each breath thin and useless. The wind here never stops. Snow bites exposed skin like static. Ahead, a small stone platform sits below the summit, undisturbed for 5 centuries. In 1999, archaeologists recovered 3 frozen Inca children from the summit of Lulayaco volcano, their bodies so well preserved by the cold that internal organs remained intact. The ritual, called capacocha, was reserved for moments of extreme importance, a new emperor's coronation, a natural disaster, or a plea for good harvests. Selected children, chosen for physical perfection and often from noble families, were fed a rich diet for months beforehand, then walked hundreds of miles to a sacred mountain summit called an apu, believed to be a living deity capable of controlling weather and fertility. Johann Reinhard, the archaeologist who led the 1999 discovery, published his findings through National Geographic, detailing how the children's stomach contents revealed a final meal, followed by chicha, a fermented corn beverage likely mixed with substances that induced sleep before death by exposure. Picture a 7-year-old girl, wrapped in fine woven textiles, arranged in a seated position, drifting into a cold sleep she never wakes from. The wider consequence reinforced Inca political control across a vast empire, sending a child from a conquered province to die honorably on a sacred mountain bound that region's elite family to the empire through shared grief and prestige, a strategy that helped hold together thousands of miles of annexed territory without constant military force. Imagine being the child's mother, watching your daughter walk away in ceremonial dress, told this is the greatest honor a family can receive. However, some researchers, including bioarchaeologist Andrew Wilson, argue toxicology results suggest the children may have died peacefully in their sleep rather than through fear or suffering, complicating the assumption of a purely violent death. If sacrifice could look like mercy on a mountaintop, what happened when an entire empire believed the sun itself demanded blood on a massive scale? #6. The Sati Immolation Ritual of Ancient India. Imagine standing at the edge of a riverbank funeral ground in ancient India. Sandalwood smoke curls upward. Bells ring somewhere in the crowd. A widow, dressed in her finest clothing, walks slowly toward a raised wooden platform beside her husband's body. Colonial British records from the early 1800s documented an estimated 500 to 600 cases of sati annually in Bengal alone, before the practice was formally outlawed in 1829. The custom, rooted in a concept called padavrata, ultimate wifely devotion, held that a widow who died alongside her husband's cremation would ensure both souls' union in the afterlife and bring merit to her family's honor. Social and economic pressure often reinforced participation, since widows had few property rights and could face social exile. British administrator and historian William Bentinck, who abolished the practice through the Bengal Sati Regulation of 1829, based his decision partly on reports gathered by reformer Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who documented cases where widows appeared coerced or drugged before the act. Picture the widow climbing onto the pyre, flames already licking at dried wood, the crowd chanting prayers as smoke rises around her. The domino effect reshaped colonial law and Indian social reform simultaneously. The abolition became a flashpoint in debates over British interference in Indian religious practice, fueling both genuine reform movements led by Indian intellectuals and resentment that colonial rulers used the issue to justify broader control over Indian society. Imagine being a young widow in that era, 17 years old, with no husband, no property, and a village watching to see what you'll choose. However, historians like Latamani argue the practice's frequency and voluntary nature were often exaggerated by British colonial writers, seeking to portray Indian society as barbaric and in need of Western moral guidance. If devotion could be twisted into a death sentence, what happened when death became a competitive sport played for a screaming crowd? #5. The Gladiatorial Munera of ancient Rome. Imagine sitting in the Colosseum on a summer afternoon in 80 CE. Sand covers the arena floor, already dark in patches. The smell of sweat, blood, and animal dung fills the air. 80,000 voices roar at once, shaking the stone beneath you. Historical records suggest the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 CE lasted 100 days, and ancient sources claim thousands of animals and numerous gladiators died during the events. The spectacle originated from a funerary custom called munus, meaning obligation or duty, a blood offering originally meant to honor the dead. Over centuries, the practice evolved from small private rituals into massive state-funded political theater, with emperors using games to display wealth, mercy, and control over life and death in front of the entire population. Historian Keith Hopkins, in his research on Roman social structure published through Cambridge Studies, analyzed funerary inscriptions and arena records showing many gladiators were enslaved people or prisoners of war, though some were surprisingly free men who volunteered for fame and money. Picture a gladiator facing an opponent under the emperor's box, sand sticking to sweat-soaked skin, the crowd's noise, the last thing filling his ears before the final blow lands. The consequence reached deep into Roman economics and politics. Owning and training gladiators became a lucrative industry, with entire schools called ludi built around breeding, feeding, and betting on fighters, while emperors who failed to provide spectacular games risked public unrest and loss of political support. Imagine being a free Roman citizen who volunteered for the arena, drawn by promised fame, only to realize the contract binds you until death or victory, whichever comes first. However, some historians argue actual gladiator death rates were lower than popular imagination suggests, since trained fighters were expensive investments that owners preferred to keep alive for repeated matches rather than lose in a single afternoon. If entertainment could demand this level of bloodshed, what happens when an entire village disappears into a bog? Preserved perfectly for 2,000 years as evidence of something far darker, #4, the bog body sacrifices of Iron Age Europe. Imagine walking through a peat bog in Denmark at dawn, mist clinging low to the ground. The earth here is soft, almost sponge-like underfoot. Somewhere beneath the surface, a body has waited more than 2,000 years, skin still intact, face still recognizable. Tolland man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, was so well preserved by the bog's chemistry that investigators initially believed he was a recent murder victim. Bog bodies across northern Europe often show signs of what archaeologists call overkill, multiple methods of death applied to a single victim, including strangulation, throat cutting, and blunt trauma combined. Researchers believe the acidic, low-oxygen environment of peat bogs, combined with cold temperatures, prevented normal bacterial decomposition, essentially mummifying soft tissue that would otherwise vanish within years. Archaeologist P.V. Glob, who studied Tolland man extensively and published his findings in the 1965 book The Bog People, proposed that many victims were sacrificed to a fertility goddess, based on the careful, ritualistic positioning of bodies and the fine rope still found around some necks. Picture Tolland man's final hours. A rope tightened slowly around his neck. His body then lowered gently into shallow water, arranged with what looks like ceremonial care rather than violence. The wider consequence reveals a pattern across cultures under stress. Many bog bodies date to periods of dramatic climate cooling, suggesting communities turn to increasingly extreme sacrifice as crop failures and famine spread, escalating ritual violence as a desperate attempt to control forces they couldn't otherwise explain. Imagine being a member of that community, Watching harvests fail 2 years running? Believing your neighbor's death might be the only thing standing between your village and starvation. However, some researchers, including archaeologist Miranda Aldhouse Green, argue not all bog bodies represent sacrifice. Some may be executed criminals, and distinguishing punishment from religious ritual in 2,000-year-old remains often relies on interpretation rather than certainty. If a rope around one neck could mean either an offering to the gods or a criminal's execution, what ritual required not one death, but an entire dynasty to be buried alive together? #3. The royal tomb burials of ancient UR. Imagine descending into a shaft beneath the city of around 2500 BCE. Torchlight flickers against mud brick walls. The air is stale, thick with incense and something else. Dozens of bodies arranged in neat rows, dressed as if for a procession that never ended. Excavations led between 1922 and 1934 uncovered the remains of up to 74 attendants buried alongside a single royal tomb, all appearing to have died in the same event. The practice tied into a belief that royalty required a full retinue in the afterlife: guards, musicians, servants, and animals, to maintain the same standard of living beyond death. Toxicological analysis later suggested many attendants may have ingested a substance similar to cyanide compounds before their bodies were arranged, meaning death likely came before burial rather than through live entombment. Archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who excavated the site starting in 1922, documented lyres, jewelry, and headdresses still in position on skeletons. Work later, re-examined in 2009 by researcher Janet Mong, using CT scans that revealed skull trauma inconsistent with poison alone. Picture a court musician, harp still in her lap, arranged in a row beside a queen's chariot and oxen, all facing the same direction into the dark. The consequence extended into how Sumerian civilization structured loyalty itself. This kind of mass retainer sacrifice reinforced a rigid social hierarchy, signaling to the living that service to the crown extended past death, a message that helped stabilize succession and discourage rebellion during vulnerable transition periods between rulers. Imagine being one of those attendants, drinking a ceremonial cup during the funeral procession, unaware or perhaps fully aware that it's the last thing you'll ever taste. However, Janet Monge's 2009 reanalysis suggests some victims suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating a more violent death than the peaceful poisoning theory long assumed, reigniting debate over how voluntary these sacrifices truly were. If servants died to follow their king into the next world, what happened when an entire empire believed the sun would stop rising unless a river of blood were paid every single day? #2. The mass sacrifice festivals of the Moche civilization. Imagine standing in a plaza in northern Peru around 500 CE. Rain rarely falls here, but today the sky is heavy and dark. Painted priests in jaguar and bird costumes stand atop a massive adobe platform. Below, dozens of captured warriors kneel in a line, stripped of armor. Excavations at the Moche site of Huaca de la Luna uncovered the remains of more than 70 sacrificed young men, many showing evidence of ritualized combat before death. The ritual, reconstructed largely through painted ceramic scenes, archaeologists call sacrifice ceremony imagery, appears tied to El Niño weather events, sudden catastrophic rains that destroyed irrigation systems the Moche depended on for survival. Priests likely believed these captured warriors' blood, offered to mountain and sea deities, could restore balance to a climate spiraling out of control. Archaeologist Steve Bourget, who excavated Huaca de la Luna throughout the 1990s and published findings through the University of Texas Press, documented skeletal remains showing throat-cutting and dismemberment patterns matching scenes depicted on painted Moche pottery centuries earlier. Picture a captured warrior forced through a ritual battle he cannot win, then march to the platform's edge. As rain clouds gather, his blood meant to bargain with the sky itself. The wider consequence shows civilization strain in real time. Archaeological layers reveal these mass sacrifice events clustered heavily during periods of severe El Niño flooding, suggesting escalating desperation as disasters worsened. The Moche state responded not with irrigation innovation, but with larger and more frequent bloodletting, a pattern some researchers link to the civilization's eventual collapse. Imagine being a young Moche man captured in a ritual battle, understanding that this contest was never designed to be a fair fight, but a selection process for the platform above. However, some scholars argue that not every sacrificed individual was a captured enemy. Isotope analysis on some remains suggests certain victims were local Moche people, complicating the theory that sacrifice was solely aimed at outsiders. If a civilization would spill blood to beg the sky for rain, what happens when believers convince an entire nation that hundreds of children must die to stop an apocalypse already underway? Has Hone, the children's sacrifice of Las Animas, and the Huanchaco apocalypse event. Imagine standing on a windswept cliff above the Pacific coast near Huanchaco, Peru, around 1450 CE. The ocean roars below. More than 140 small footprints lead toward the cliff's edge, walking in a single direction, never returning. In 2011, archaeologists excavated the remains of 140 sacrificed children and 200 llamas at the site of Huanchaquito Las Llamas, making it the largest single child sacrifice event ever documented archaeologically. Radiocarbon dating and sediment analysis suggest the sacrifice coincided with catastrophic flooding, likely caused by a severe El Niño event, a climate disruption capable of destroying crops and coastal infrastructure across the entire Chimu Kingdom in a matter of weeks. Researchers believe Chimu Kingdom priests, facing what looked like the collapse of their world, staged a sacrifice event on a scale never previously attempted, believing children's hearts held special purity capable of appeasing furious gods. Archaeologist Gabriel Prieto, who led the excavation beginning in 2011 and published findings in the journal PLOS I in 2018, discovered cut marks on the children's sternums consistent with chest-opening rituals, alongside footprints preserved in now hardened mud showing some children were led, not dragged, to the site. Picture a child no older than 8, walking barefoot through drying mud beside dozens of others, led by adults she trusts completely, unaware of what waits ahead. The consequence proved catastrophic rather than protective. Despite the unprecedented scale of sacrifice, the Chimu Kingdom's agricultural and political structure never fully recovered from the climate disaster, and within decades, the weakened kingdom fell to the expanding Inca Empire, meaning the largest child sacrifice in the archaeological record failed entirely to save the civilization that performed it. Imagine being a Chimu mother in that year, watching priests select children for a ceremony you're told will save everyone, holding on to the belief that your child's death carries meaning too large to question. However, Gabriel Prieto and his research team emphasized the event likely wasn't panic-driven cruelty, but a highly organized, planned ceremony conducted over multiple days, suggesting the Chimu state approached even catastrophe with rigid bureaucratic order rather than chaos. Looking back at these 10 rituals, a common pattern emerges. Most occurred during times of crisis, drought, flood, war, or the transfer of power. Faced with forces beyond their control or comprehension, ancient peoples turned to the ultimate form of control, sacrificing lives to bargain with the cosmos. From the bogs of Denmark to the peaks of the Andes, and from the temples of Carthage to the coast of Peru, the common thread was not random cruelty, but an internal logic, however horrific, held by societies that believed death could purchase life. It is worth noting that many of these rituals, when recorded by rival civilizations or later colonizers, were exaggerated or distorted for political ends, to justify conquest, invasion, or subjugation. This raises a difficult question. Are we looking at actual history, or at a version of history told by the victors? Today, while blood sacrifice is a thing of the past, humans still turn to collective rituals when facing crisis, only the forms have changed. The question remains for the viewer. If our ancestors believed the death of the few could save the many, has that logic truly vanished? Or has it simply taken on a new name,